There's a certain segment of the population that is enamored with the Constitution and the whole doctrine and ideology of the founding. Oh, how they love liberty, how they love free speech. They then get all huffy and puffy about racist, referring to the phrase, all men are created equal, a statement as obviously false as it is morally dangerous. And for those who consider themselves staunch advocates of the founders, they are using the founders' own words to radically deviate from founders' intent. First, let's look at the immigration laws they passed. The first immigration law was passed by Congress in 1790. It was the 29th bill passed by Congress, and it limited citizenship to, quote, free white men. White only was the rule for immigration in the United States for most of its history. And there was a period from around 1840 to 1882 when Chinese were able to immigrate to the US simply because the US had no policy toward the Chinese. But in 1882, there were 106,000 Chinese out of a population of 50 million, or 0.2% of the population. However, even this was considered too many, and so the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. From there, the Chinese population of the US dropped. In 1923, there was the case of the United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind. It was found that Singh and all people from the subcontinent of India were not white and were ineligible for citizenship. This led to the revocation of citizenship and deportation of around 20,000 Asian Indians living in the United States. In 1924, the 1924 Immigration Act was passed, which required all immigration to be proportional to the current population groups within the United States. The breakdown, of course, began with the Luce-Seller Act in 1946 that allowed for Filipino and Indian Americans living in the U.S. to become U.S. citizen, and then, of course, came the Hart-Celler Act of 1965. But for most of the United States history, the immigration policy has been, with very minor exceptions, white only. In terms of founders' intent, we can't say with analytic certainty how they would have treated racial segregation, given that there weren't enough free blacks or Amerindians or Asians trying to live among whites for the issue to even rise to significance. We do know, however, that they tolerated slavery, despite having misgivings about it, though not in the way you might think. What few segregation laws existed, they tolerated. 44 of the 50 states had, at one point, laws against race mixing. States with larger black populations were more likely to have anti-race mixing laws. Thomas Jefferson said of the situation, quote, "It will probably be asked, why not retain and incorporate the blacks into the state, and thus save the expense of supplying, by importation of white settlers, the vacancies they will leave. Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties, and produce convulsions which will probably never end but in the extermination of the one or the other race." Jefferson also wrote about the future of the whole of the Americas, North and South, to be demographically conquered by white people. Our present federal limits are not too large for good government, nor will the increase in votes in Congress produce any ill effect. On the contrary, it will drown the little divisions at present existing there. Our Confederacy must be viewed as the nest from which all America, North and South, is to be peopled. We should take care, too, not to think of it for the interests of that great continent to press too soon on the Spaniards. Those countries cannot be in better hands. My fear is that they are too feeble to hold them till our population can be sufficiently advanced to gain it from them piece by piece. James Madison also wrote about the incompatibility of whites and blacks, saying, quote, "To be consistent with existing and probably unalterable prejudices in the U.S., the freed blacks ought to be permanently removed beyond the region occupied by or allotted to a white population. The objections to a thorough incorporation of the two people are, with most of the whites insuperable, and are admitted by all of them to be very powerful. If the blacks, strongly marked as they are by physical and lasting peculiarities, be retained amid the whites under the degrading privation of equal whites, political or social, they must be always dissatisfied with their condition as a change only from one to another species of oppression, always secretly confederated against. The character of the free blacks, even when their legal condition is least affected by their color, seems to put these truths beyond question. It is material also that the removal of the blacks be to a distance precluding the jealousies and hostilities to be apprehended from a neighboring people, stimulated by the contempt known to be entertained for their peculiar features, to say nothing of their vindictive recollections or the predatory propensities which their state of society might foster. A little bit wordy, but it's kind of like he had a crystal ball predicting what we would get with an integrated black population in the US. When people talk about slavery, they usually speak in terms of black emancipation and liberation. Benjamin Franklin was, of course, opposed to slavery, but he described it a little bit differently, saying, quote, "The Negroes brought into the English sugar islands have greatly diminished the whites there. The poor are by this means deprived of employment, while a few families acquire vast estates, which they spend on foreign luxuries, and educating their children in the habit of those luxuries. The same income is needed for the support of one that might have maintained 100. The whites who have slaves not laboring are enfeebled, and therefore not so generally prolific. The slaves, being worked too hard and ill-fed, their constitutions are broken, and the deaths among them are more than the births, so that a continual supply is needed from Africa. The northern colonies, having few slaves, increase in whites. Slaves also pejorate the families that use them. The white children become proud, disgusted with labor, and being educated in idleness are rendered unfit to get a living by industry." Benjamin also saw the New World as an opportunity to create a kind of New Europe, saying, quote, "Which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionately very small. All Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny, America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so. And in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also, the Saxons only excepted, who, with the English, make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I could wish their numbers were increased. And while we are, as I may call it, scouring the planet by clearing America of woods and so making this side of the globe reflect a brighter light to the eyes of the inhabitants in Mars or Venus, why should we, in the sight of superior beings, darken its people? Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America, where we have so fair an opportunity, by excluding all blacks and tawnies, of increasing the lovely white and red? But perhaps I am partial to the complexion of my country, for such kind of partiality is natural to mankind." While I think Ben may have had some incorrect views on the appearance of populations that could perhaps be forgiven for the time, he's yet another founder who wanted a white America. In 1821, there was a dispute over whether a black person who was granted citizenship in one state was entitled to recognize citizenship in another state if that state did not allow blacks to be citizen. Charles Pinckney, one of the authors of the Constitution, particularly the clause about citizenship being recognized in all states, wrote, quote, "I was the only member of that body that ever submitted the plan of a constitution completely drawn in articles and sections, and this having been done at a very early state of their proceedings. The article on which now so much stress is laid, and on the meaning of which the whole of this question is made to turn, and which is in these words, quote, 'The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities in every state, having been made by me, it is supposed I must know, or perfectly recollect what I meant by it. In answer, I say that at the time I drew that Constitution, I perfectly knew that there did not exist such a thing in the Union as a black or colored citizen, nor could I then have conceived it possible such a thing could have ever existed in it. Nor, notwithstanding all that has been said on the subject, do I now believe one does exist in it." Is that clear enough for you? As the United States expanded west, there was a debate as to whether or not to extend slavery westward. David Wilmot, in describing the Wilmot Proviso, which would ban slavery from all territory acquired during the Mexican-American War, said, quote, "An effort is made to bring odium upon this movement, as one designed specifically for the benefit of the black race. While its success would ensure the redemption at an earlier day of the Negro from his bondage and his chains, I deny that it was especially for him that the proviso was offered, or that he is the party most deeply interested in the result. It has, with justice and propriety, been called the white man's proviso, and the free white laborer has by far the deepest stake in its failure or success. For him, it solves the momentous question whether that vast country between the Rio Grande and the Pacific shall be given up to the servile labor of the black or be preserved for the free labor of the white man. Shall that fair clime, with its rich soil and abundant resources capable of sustaining a population of 50 millions of freemen, be preserved to the white man and his posterity, or shall it be given up to the African and his descendants? And this was a common thread among Western states, to not allow slavery and thus blacks to gain any foothold whatsoever. In the Constitution of the state of Oregon it says, quote, "No free Negro or mulatto not residing in this state at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall come, reside, or be within this state, or hold any real estate, or make any contracts, or maintain any suit therein. And the Legislative Assembly shall provide by penal laws for the removal by public officers of all such Negroes and mulattoes, and for their effectual exclusion from the state, and for the punishment of persons who shall bring them into the state, or employ them, or harbor them." A passage from Jared Taylor's essay, What the Founders Really Thought About Race. Nor was abolitionist sentiment anything close to universal. Many Northerners opposed abolition because they feared it would lead to race mixing. The easiest way to stir up opposition to Northern abolitionists was to claim that they were really promoting intermarriage. Many abolitionists expressed strong disapproval of miscegenation, but the fact that speakers at abolitionist meetings addressed racially mixed audiences was sufficiently shocking to make any charge believable. There were no fewer than 165 anti-abolition riots in the North during the 1820s alone, almost all of them prompted by the fear that abolition would lead to intermarriage. The 1830s saw further violence. On July 4, 1834, the American Anti-Slavery Society read its Declaration of Sentiments to a mixed-race audience in New York City. Rioters then broke up the meeting and went on a rampage that lasted 11 days. The National Guard managed to bring peace only after the society issued a disclaimer, the first point of which was, quote, "We entirely disclaim any desire to promote or encourage intermarriage between white and colored persons." Philadelphia suffered a serious riot in 1838 after abolitionists, who had had trouble renting a space to hold their meetings, built their own building. On May 17th, the last day of a 3-day dedication ceremony, several thousand people, many of high social standing, gathered at the hall and had burned it down while the fire department stood by and did nothing. The record from colonial times to the end of the Civil War is therefore one of starkly inegalitarian views. The idea of colonizing blacks was eventually abandoned as too costly, but until the second half of the 20th century, it would be very hard to find a prominent American who spoke about race in today's terms. In 1884, the Supreme Court officially determined that the 14th Amendment did not confer citizenship on Indians associated with tribes. They did not receive citizenship until an act of Congress in 1924. The traditional American view, Mark Twain called the Indian a good, fair, desirable subject for extermination if there ever was one, cannot be retroactively transformed into incipient egalitarianism and celebration of diversity. Mark Twain said, quote, "There was similar disdain for Asians. State and federal laws excluded them from citizenship, and as late as 1914, the Supreme Court ruled that the states could deny naturalization to Asians. Nor was the urge to exclude Asians limited to conservatives. At the 1910 Socialist Party Congress, the Committee on Immigration called for the unconditional exclusion of Chinese and Japanese, on the grounds that America already had enough problems with Negroes." Samuel Gompers, the most famous labor leader in American history, fought to improve the lives of working people, but whites were his first priority. It must be clear to every thinking man and woman that while there is hardly a single reason for the admission of Asiatics, there are hundreds of good and strong reasons for their absolute exclusion. The ban on Chinese immigration and naturalization continued until 1943, when Congress established a Chinese immigration quota of 105 people a year. Even if we restrict the field to American presidents, a group notoriously disinclined to say anything controversial, we find that Jefferson's and Lincoln's thinking on race continued well into the modern era. James Garfield wrote, quote, "I have a strong feeling of repugnance when I think of the Negro being made our political equal, and I would be glad if they could be colonized, sent to heaven, or got rid of in any decent way." Theodore Roosevelt wrote in 1901 that he had, quote, not been able to think out any solution to the terrible problem offered by the presence of the Negro on this continent, close quote. As for Indians, he once said, quote, I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are the dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are, and I shouldn't inquire too closely into the health of the 10th. Woodrow Wilson was a confirmed segregationist, and as president of Princeton, he refused to admit blacks. He enforced segregation in government offices and favored exclusion of Asians. Quote, we cannot make a homogeneous population of a people who do not blend with the Caucasian race. Oriental coolieism will give us another race problem to solve, and surely we have had our lesson. Warren Harding wanted the races separate. Men of both races, black and white, may well stand uncompromisingly against every suggestion of social equality. This is not a question of social equality, but a question of recognizing a fundamental, eternal, inescapable difference. Racial amalgamation there cannot be. In 1921, Vice President-elect Calvin Coolidge wrote in Good Housekeeping about the basis for sound immigration policy, quote, there are racial considerations too grave to be brushed aside for any sentimental reasons. Biological laws tell us that certain divergent people will not mix or blend. Quality of mind and body suggests that observance of ethnic law is as great a necessity to a nation as immigration law. Harry Truman wrote, quote, I am strongly of the opinion Negroes ought to be in Africa, yellow men in Asia, and white men in Europe and America. He also referred to the blacks on the White House staff as, quote, an army of coons. As recent a president as Dwight Eisenhower argued that although it might be necessary to grant blacks certain political rights, this did not mean social equality, or that a Negro should court my daughter. It is only with John Kennedy that we finally find a president whose conception of race begins to be acceptable by today's standards. Today's egalitarians are therefore radical dissenters from traditional American thinking. A conception of America as a nation of people with common values, culture, and heritage is far more faithful to the vision of the founders. Until 1965, the United States immigration policy was, with minor exceptions, white only. Any state with a substantial non-white population had laws against race mixing. Every northern state passed laws to keep the blacks away, and every newly formed state west of the Mississippi passed laws to bar slavery to keep the blacks out. The state of Oregon going so far as to prohibit blacks from entering the state in their own constitution. Today, the average black costs on net around $10,000 more per head than they pay in taxes. The Hispanics cost around $7,300 more per head than they pay in taxes. Hispanics being a population of significant Amerindian admixture. The European proportion being Spanish, who, despite being European, the founders were also not particularly fond of. Non-Europeans in the United States oppose free speech, they oppose economic freedom, and demand resources from whites. Every dire prediction of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison has come to pass. This is the price of hubris and fantasy. The hubris of wanting a big American empire, of wanting to incorporate all types of people into a pan-racial America, and the fantasy that it would be anything but endless misery. Now, you can point to the judges ruling that segregation and anti-race mixing laws are unconstitutional. Well, this is very much like the so-called leadership of the Church of Latter-day Saints. Brigham Young made it very clear what the Mormon Church had to say about race mixing. Quote, shall I tell you the law of God in regard to the African race? If the white man who belongs to the chosen seed mixes his blood with the seed of Cain, the penalty under the law of God is death on the spot. This will always be so. Brigham Young was also very clear that no blacks may become clergy, and this was church policy his whole life. And yet, modern quote-unquote leaders of the church are going around saying that the real Mormon doctrine is to allow in blacks. To an outsider, it's very obvious what's going on. The LDS church is craving to outside political pressure and is abandoning its doctrine, which is to say it's no longer Mormon but some politically correct group therapy center. Likewise, the evidence is also very clear regarding the founders of the United States. To an outsider, it's very, very obvious what's going on. To say that anti-race mixing laws are unconstitutional when the founders not only allowed such laws to persist, but openly supported them whenever they spoke about it, this is all just retconning. The people who literally wrote the Constitution openly supported anti-miscegenation laws. Freedom and liberty are white ideas, and the founders knew that. And the dire predictions they made if white Americans deviated from the racial compact have all been borne out. If you are big on the Constitution, on the founders, on liberty, well, they were white nationalists. And the US Constitution is inextricably bound with white nationalism. It is a package deal. And if you want to have more of an idea for why this is, I recommend another video I made called The Genetic Mesh.